Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Okay, let's talk Warlocks. The class that always felt a little bit like a system hack received several upgrades in the 2024 Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook, and that is universally true for their subclasses. What do I mean by universal? I mean that even the subclasses that weren't updated got a base improvement. See, in 2024, all Warlock subclasses give their bonus spells as free preparations, and while there's no official ruling for the 2014 Ruleset subclasses and how they interact, I can't imagine a DM saying that they don't get the spells prepared. And if that is true, then every subclass is substantially better, even the Undying. That said, the ones that were updated all received improvements beyond just the benefit to the spell list. So how do the updated subclasses stack up with the great old ones? One of the updates to the Warlock class is that all subclasses come online at 3rd level now, so the order is reversed. Whereas in 2014, Warlocks got their Patron at 1st level and their Pact at 3rd, now you get potentially your Pact at 1st and your Patron at 3rd. Why do I say potentially? Well, the biggest change to the Warlock is that Pacts are now invocations, and you are capable of picking multiple or none. This is good for clarity's sake, since when Warlocks were first introduced in 2014, there actually was a debate whether the Pact or the Patron was the real subclass. And while it became immediately clear with the publication of the first additional patron, the Undying, what was the real subclass choice, you have to remember that the foundation of the Warlock class is choice, and the Pact was a substantial decision point. So while the first attempt out the gate wasn't anything to write home about, future entries proved to be very popular and offer all kinds of new themes, but they all hew further away from the original concept of the Dungeons & Dragons Warlock. Oh, if you're wondering where I get some of my thoughts about the history of the Warlock and other classes, my friend Brandis Stoddard did a great run of articles going over the history of classes. I'll put the link in the description. See, the Warlock has a tumultuous history in Dungeons & Dragons game design, but the most clear forebearer to the 5th edition version is the one introduced in 3.5. That one was built entirely around invocations and drawing powers from a preternatural source. In that edition, you were required to be either chaotic or evil, and that corresponds to the conceived of patrons you might have. These patrons are all pretty well represented by the 3 that were introduced in the 2014 Player's Handbook, the Archfey, the Great Old One, and the Fiend. Still, in 3.5, there was quite a bit of desire in the design space to introduce a celestial option as well, seeing as how the Eldritch Disciple was an incredibly popular prestige class meant for Cleric Warlock multiclassing. So that gets represented in the Celestial in 5e. Also, we should probably get this out of the way, but one of the reasons why the Pact had such traction as the perceived subclass in conversation was that the 2014 Player's Handbook patrons were 2 subpar and 1 great option. We need to address that the Archfey and the Great Old One were not just unexciting but fairly bad subclasses in 2014. So let's look at the Archfey in the 2024 Player's Handbook and let a wave of joy sweep over you. It would have been a substantial upgrade just to receive the bonus spells as prepared, but this is a subclass that looks fun to play because this is the Teleportation Warlock. Subclass features kick in at 3rd level as they do now with all classes, so this is a change for Warlocks since they used to get their subclass at 1st level. After that, they get features at 6th, 10th, and 14th level. Meanwhile, now at the 1st level, they get an invocation. The Archfey trades the relatively underpowered Area of Effect charm ability it used to get at 1st for greater synergy with its spellcasting, leaning into being the Warlock that is all about teleporting. The Archfey benefits from the change in Warlock bonus spell design by getting Misty Step as one of their automatic spells prepared, not to mention bonus castings equal to their Charisma modifier. On top of that, they get rider effects to choose to tack on to their Misty Steps. This starts at 2 choices at 3rd level and gain 2 more options at 6th level. All are fantastic options. And their spell list possesses tons of great options beyond Misty Step, like Plant Growth or that dominates Person and Beast. 6th level lets the Archfey Misty Step as a reaction to taking damage, which more elegantly handles the 6th level defensive teleportation ability that the Archfey had in 2014, allowing them to add the various rider effects to their Misty Escape. 10th level makes them immune to the Charmed condition and gives a once per short rest defensive psychic attack. And 14th triples down on the teleportation theme by letting the Archfey teleport for free as part of casting enchantment or illusion spells as an action. The Archfey is a massively improved subclass that reads as incredibly fun to play. The game now has strong support for an all-Fey party, by the way, with a Fey Wanderer Ranger, Archfey Warlock, Oath of the Ancients Paladin, and, Druids! And you know, teleportation is a hallmark of the puckish Fey folk trickster archetype, and the Archfey delivers. What with their various side effects that they can impose on their teleports, like temp HP or invisibility. The only reason this doesn't get most improved on this list is because it goes to someone else. Next up is the Celestial Warlock, the counter to the traditional dark image of a Warlock. In theory, this is the easiest Warlock to play as good, but there can be darkness behind the eyes of angels or unicorns too. This is the subclass that was probably changed the least since its first appearance in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. The most notable change is the spell list itself, in addition to the obvious change that they get all of their spells as prepared. The spell list remains full of healing and heavenly themed entries. When first published, these tended to be a hard choice, since healing spells are usually circumstantial, and the Warlock doesn't get a lot of spells known. It's a lot more palatable with them preloaded on your list. The standout for me is Summon Celestial, a spell that seems absurdly obvious to have on their list, but didn't exist when the subclass was first published. They still get Sacred Flame as a free cantrip, which remains a weird choice on a Warlock, given the reliance on Eldritch Blast for the class. Their third level ability is a pretty simple pool of healing dice that they can use as a bonus action. This is fairly comparable to Paladin's Lay on Hands, but has the benefits of being at range. It replaces the need for Healing Word, which is good given the lack of spell slots on the class. 6th level allows you to add your Charisma modifier to damage once per turn to a spell that deals fire or radiant damage. This is trickier to use than you might think, but there are lots of options. However, I find it so weird that they do not get the ability at this level to change Eldritch Blast's damage type to Radiant. It seems like table stakes and would be in line with what we'll see with the Great Old One. 10th level is pretty dope, but with an asterisk. The Celestial Warlock gets the ability to give temporary HP to themselves and everyone in the party, and it's a good amount, but it's very similar and distinctly worse than the Inspiring Leader feat. Temporary HP doesn't stack, so the value of this is diminished if a player has the Inspiring Leader feat already, but it will still find its use. This is never a ribbon, but the value of it will be judged by choices made already in the game. 14th level is an explosion of healing energy that kicks in if you or an ally goes down, getting the downed member back up and bursting out with damage to all nearby enemies. Some games, you will see this used a lot, and other games not so much. It's nice to have if needed. The Celestial Patron benefits dramatically from the inclusion of their bonus spells as spells prepared. It also benefits from the advancements in the base design of the class. Put a pin in that, but otherwise is pretty much untouched from its version in Xanathar's. One thing I would like to note that this is the best foundation for a proper Pathfinder-style War Priest that I have seen in 5e. Take a 1 to 3 level dip in Fighter, then go Pact of the Blade for a Charisma to attack rolls, and up to 3 attacks, plus the full casting of a Warlock. Even the 6th level Radiant Soul feature can work in conjunction if you find a way to take Shillelagh, such as through the Pact of the Tome so you can get Agonizing Blast added onto it, as well as Pact of the Blade to make it a cantrip attack that does radiant damage. Boom, there's your once per turn smite damage. It's a solid frame that all kinds of fantasy character molds can fit into. While the Celestial is not the flashiest, who knew that it just needed a little bit of spotlight to shine? Next up, we have the flip side of the Celestial, the Fiend. This is the most explicitly evil patron, though as we've seen in Baldur's Gate 3, it doesn't have to be for a bad guy as a PC. I mean, this is the default concept for the Warlock, right? Like when the 3.5 Warlock was conceived, this was clearly the core idea. Deal with the devil. It's incredibly iconic, echelons more so than any of the other entries in the 2024 Player's Handbook. The spell list is all fire and brimstone. It's probably the list that makes the whole move from 1st to 3rd level more awkward, since what Warlock is wasting a packed magic slot on Burning Hands, even at 3rd level? The features haven't changed much since the Fiend premiered in the 2014 Player's Handbook. It was the MVP then and remains a strong subclass. 3rd level gets a slight buff, letting the Fiend get a pile of temporary HP whenever you or anyone downs an enemy near you. 6th level is a potent buff to saving throws, letting the Fiend add a d10 a number of times per day equal to their charisma modifier. 10th level is the pure awesomeness of getting resistance to any one type of damage of your choice, and being able to change it on a whim, and by that I mean a short rest. The 14th level feature, Hurl Through Hell, is the only aspect of the Fiend that was really nerfed, now requiring a saving throw when the lack thereof was the real selling point of the ability in 2014. It is still a fine feature to have, but it is less game-changing at this point. This leaves us with a subclass that remains extremely strong in 2024, but roughly in the same tier that it started in. The Fiend is an excellent choice for anyone looking to play up the classic Warlock. And this brings us to the most improved Warlock subclass in 2024, the Great Old One. This is the Warlock for players who prefer their horror in an Eldritch Lovecraftian sort of way, calling on the power of non-Euclidean geometry to madden their foes before destroying them. It's no surprise that the Great Old One Warlock is all about psychic powers. Their spell list certainly reads like a psionic character. At 3rd level, they keep the relatively weak telepathic power that they had in the 2014 version, but now they also get the ability to change out the damage type of their spells to be psychic instead of what have you. Lastly, at 3rd level, they can cast illusion and enchantment spells without using somatic or verbal components. 6th level went from a fairly mediocre defensive ability to an example of design synergy, making the 3rd level telepathic feature much more aggressive. 10th level takes a moment to double down on the value of Hex, making it now affect enemy saving throws in addition to skill checks. And 14th level lets you cast Summon Aberration without using concentration, much like the Fey Wanderer Ranger would summon Fey, giving you a Thrall. Compare that to the 2014's version of 10th and 14th levels, which was just some weak psionic defenses and a charm effect. Massive improvements. The Great Old One has gone from barely a subclass to a real beast able to control minds or rend them asunder. So looking at 2024, we see a lot of fundamental quality of life improvements just by virtue of the spell list modification, and huge benefits to the existing subclasses that were ported over. Now, assuming that the subclasses that were not updated to 2024 get that foundational boost to their spells known, how do they hold up? Well, with one very notable exception, what was left was certainly an oops all bangers list. In lore, both real-world and D&D specific, and mechanically, these were some real winners. I mean, we've got the Fathomless, the Genie, the Undead, and the Hexblade? And then sure, yeah, we've got the Undying. Yes, it's the bad one. Anyway, just look at that list. All of them scream to be character concepts, and all were on the top end of Warlock tier rankings with the 2014 rule set. Oh, for the record, I'm going off of Treant Monk's tier list when I say that, by the way. I'll put a link in the description. But yeah, each makes a ton of sense as PCs, but traditionally weren't Warlocks themselves. The Genie, for example, was represented in the Shire class. The Undead was the Dread Necromancer. The Hexblade was the Hexblade. The point is that these were all folded in under the banner of the Warlock for presentation and shared thematic reasons. Just like an Eldritch Knight and a Samurai are both viewed as types of fighters, even though one is a magic guy and the other is a vaguely insensitive stereotype. But let's begin with the Fathomless, both because that's going alphabetically, which I often default to, but also because it's probably the least supported flavor of Warlock in older class design. It's the Water Warlock, though I suppose it has its own Lovecraftian vibe. I mean, it's perfect for an Ironborn type spellcaster, and obviously works as an alternate waterbender. However, while I'm sure there were prestige classes somewhere in the glut of 3.5 that addressed this particular archetype, I can't think of a good match when it comes to base classes. And you know what? I don't know the 2E kits that well, so I don't want to make that as too hard a blanket statement. Suffice it to say, the empowered by the forces below style of Warlock certainly is flavorful, but specific. The spell list is more or less what you'd expect. Now, Silence is very interesting, and the list as a whole gets more powerful at the higher levels with things like Summon Elemental and Sleet Storm. At 1st/3rd level, the Fathomless gets the table stakes power of breathing underwater with his swim speed. Can you imagine if they didn't? Then, because this is a subclass from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, the Fathomless gets a pretty decent ability that scales and uses with proficiency bonus. but in power with Warlock level. In this case, a tentacle that acts like spiritual weapon, but with a slow effect rider. And I will tell you right here that if the subclass were updated to 2024, that tentacle should probably start at 2d8 damage instead of 1d8, and scale to 3d8 instead of 2d8. This won't be a problem because the class feature would be moved from 1st to 3rd. Anyway, the tentacle was probably a little weak before, but had to be balanced against players dipping 1 to 2 levels of Warlock. In a scenario with the steeper investment of 3 levels, as it would be using the 2024 rule set, it should begin as competitive with Spiritual Weapon and then scale up. 6th level is resistance to cold damage, which, sure, I'm not going to say no, it's just not all that unique, but cold is both on brand and fairly common for damage type, especially in aquatic campaigns. But wait, there's more at 6th level, because your tentacle also gains the ability to reduce incoming damage directed at you. This is very nice design synergy, and about on par with the cold resistance in power, adding up to a pretty solid level. At 10th level, you become super good at casting Evard's Black Tentacles, gaining temporary HP when you cast it. And 14th is a water-to-water teleport for the whole party. It's limited to once per short rest, but that can be huge party mobility. And so this is frankly the least exciting of the big four, and it's still pretty amazing. As long as that spell list becomes spells prepared, this is a hugely mature Warlock design, debuting near the end of 5th edition's run, and will work fine in 2024. I think the tentacle should be a skosh stronger, but in 2024 a concentration-free spiritual weapon type effect is rare. It shines most in water campaigns, but is very solid all around. When the Genie patron was introduced in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, the Warlock finally was able to represent a design lineage that was just as storied, yet esoteric, as the classic Fiend Warlock. For here was 5e's adaptation of the Sha'ir. The Genie is the Warlock patron for Warlocks who want to be really focused spellcasters. It's certainly the most versatile subclass, since it really is 4 patrons, each a different type of Genie, each keyed to a classical element: earth, wind, fire, and water. However, regardless of your choice, you get the flavor of Aladdin with his magic lamp. How cool is that? It's also an excellent way to play a Green Lantern, which itself has allusions to Aladdin. I should note up front that there is one area that messes with the whole Warlock should get all their bonus spells as spells prepared thing that I've been touting in this video, and that's the inclusion of Wish on the Genie's list. Because higher level Warlock spells are handled through Mystic Arcanum, not spells prepared. They can't have Wish as a spell known, since they only have one spell that works with Mystic Arcanum at each level. So Wish has to be added to the general Warlock spell list for Genie patron Warlocks. It's easy enough to house rule, but it is an area where the rules don't quite work for backwards compatibility yet. However, aside from that, the Genie spell list is amazing. You get 1 spell at each level just for being the subclass, and 1 spell at each level depending on your pick of type of Genie. The base Genie spells are fine, but it's the specific list where you see a lot of flavor. As you would expect, each type of Genie, Dao, Genie, Ifriti, and Merid, provides spell options on brand for their respective element, and Dao's the winner here, man. Like, they get awesome control options like Spike Growth and Wall of Stone. Meanwhile, Genie is very airbender-y. Ifriti is the blaster option with all the classic fire spells. Lastly, Merid does well with some good control options. At 1st/3rd level, the Genie grants a lamp that can be used as a shelter and spell focus. Further, while holding it, the lamp provides a damage kicker for the damage type associated with the Genie of your choice. Dao does well here with magical bludgeoning, potentially able to use the Crusher feat with literally any type of attack, including Eldritch Blast. Hell, take Crusher on a Greatsword build and combine it with Slasher. I doubt there's any optimal use of those feats, but it's possible. 6th level reminds us that this was published in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything and gives the Genie a flight speed proficiency times per long rest. Also, they get resistance to the damage type associated with their Genie. 10th level lets you invite allies into your lamp, where they can take a short rest in only 10 minutes. Great for maximizing the short rest dependent spellcasting of Warlocks. 14th level is a lesser version of Wish, able to emulate any spell 6th level or lower. The Genie is arguably the best Warlock, certainly for a mostly Warlock build. It gives so many goodies at each level and lets the Warlock be better at what it's already good at. And it lets the player decide what that thing is. Obviously, updating this to 2024 is just cleaning up the wording of Wish being added to the spell list and making the proficiency-based flight ability be keyed off Warlock's charisma instead. Otherwise, the Genie is a great Warlock, but not game-breakingly so. I mean, how does it stack up? Well, the Afridi is a pretty even matchup with the Fiend. I'd peg the rest as being in a similar ballpark power-wise, even if I think the Dao is slightly better. I feel like the Genie's in a good position compared to the 2024 offerings. I mean, this is a mechanically sound way to explore the fantasies of having a magic lamp and a special friend that makes you awesome. It's such a classic tale brought to life in the system of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. What more could you wish for? When the Hexblade was introduced in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, for a time it seemed like it was the only Warlock subclass, especially for multiclassers. It's easily one of the most front-loaded subclasses in the game. And that was a little wild to me, since I had gotten into D&D with 3.5, where the original Hexblade was introduced as a rather weak option for people who wanted an easy spellcasting martial hybrid. Instead, we have a beast here that gives so much right out of the gate. The spell list is chock full of doozies for a melee type, although it would be better on a class with more spell slots. For example, Shield is amazing, but it's helpful to be able to cast it more than once. That said, getting them as spells prepared make it particularly nice here, since you'll have the spell at your ready if the situation arises where you'll need it. But don't forget that Hexblades also receive the benefit of the redesigned Smite spells, since their spell list includes several. The 2024 version of Smite spells are way better. This makes their spell list much more compelling, even outside of getting them as prepared for free. But then we get into the first round of class features, and check this out. 1. Medium armor and shield proficiency, on a mostly full caster. That's right, this right here is a huge buff for the survivability of the Hexblade, even if they never get close to melee. That armor class boost is huge. 2. The ability to use charisma as your attack stat for a weapon of your choice. This was the real tipping point in game design, where the attack stat being the spellcasting modifier really took off. It's so good here on the Hexblade and made them so uniquely strong at the point it was introduced. 3. Hexblade's Curse, a super version of Hex that the Hexblade can use once per short rest. Gives bonus damage equal to proficiency, an increased critical hit range against the target, and some temp HP when they go down. Really potent ability with a reasonable number of uses. And that's where most players dipped out from Hexblade. Not me though. 6th level lets you raise a specter from one of your fallen foes, letting the Hexblade dip its toe in being a pet class. Not going to always see use, but nice when the situation lets you have your little buddy. 10th is an at-will reaction defense. I've heard it doesn't compare mathematically to other defenses, but I always felt like it really upped my survivability. 14th level lets you get more use out of your Hexblade's Curse by letting you move it to a new target after killing the previous. I think it's important to remember that the Hexblade wasn't automatically bound to the Pact of the Blade. It worked fine with any other pact. So in 2024, I'm excited to see a pactless Hexblade, or a multi-pact Hexblade. It's always been more than just the melee Warlock, since all of its class features supported any playstyle for the Warlock. In 2024, the ever-popular Warlock feat, Moderately Armor, no longer does the trick of providing both medium armor and shields, further improving the value of the subclass. The revisions to Pact of the Blade may have made one aspect of this subclass less unique, but the package is still extremely strong and very front-loaded. Charisma to the attack stat isn't hard to get for a Warlock anyway. Eldritch Blast is super compelling after all. The challenge after Xanathar's Guide to Everything was to introduce subclasses that made the Hexblade not just the default option, and that was successful. Every Warlock subclass released after it in 5e, and then all of the 2024 options stand shoulder to shoulder here, and that's great. The last of the big four, it's surprising how long it took to nail Lich-themed Warlock, but the Undead is a potent patron. Now, it's not 5e's first attempt at doing a Warlock who draws upon the grave for their power, which we will still get to, but it is the successful one. The Undead comes to us from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, sporting a spell list that would make anyone's inner goth kid swoon. Spells like Phantom Steed benefit from the changes to ritual casting, with the Undead having no issues casting the ritual. Meanwhile, surprised that Greater Invisibility wasn't already on the Warlock spell list. Ditto that for Anti-Life Shell. Their entry class feature is an alternate form that you can take proficiency times per day. This provides temp HP, at-will fear effects, and immunity to fear. Very potent and nice for a multi-class dip. Probably would be revised to be the spellcasting modifier number of uses if ported to 2024. 6th level lets the Undead go without sustenance, and a damage kicker while in their Form of Dread state. 10th level brings resistance to necrotic damage and the ability to not die once per some number of long rests. The Undead recovers when dropped to 0 hit points and instead regains 2d10 plus their Warlock level and HP, which isn't bad. It's certainly one of the better versions of this type of ability, keeping the Warlock on their feet with okay HP. Then, at 14th level, the Undead gains the ability to astral project, which has powerful synergies when combined with their Form of Dread. I mean, look, this is the last Warlock designed in 5e. It is incredibly mature in design, with the exception that it possesses abilities that key off proficiency for uses, and the fact that the spells added to their list aren't automatically prepared. Everything else here feels extremely modern and would require no update to fit in with the 2024 options. And that especially makes sense here because an Undead-themed Warlock is compelling narratively, and I'd argue has almost as much grounding in lore as the Fiend. With that said, it's understandable that the first crack at a Warlock after the player's handbook in 2014 tackled this idea in similar ways. Unfortunately, when the Undying Warlock patron was introduced in the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, it was scaled to the relatively weak offerings that appeared in the 2014 Player's Handbook, the Fiend excluded, of course. It's also no surprise that the Undead was basically a full replacement for the Undying. They just gave it a different name because it literally shares no common class trait. Still, thematically, it's a good concept, so it makes sense that the Wizards of the Coast would take another swing at it. It's just kind of a shame that the Undying was left to exist in its original form, though. I mean, in 2024, the changes to spells helps a lot. There are actually some pretty interesting options, and having those automatically prepared will definitely help this class in play. Silence and Contagion in particular stand out to me. Like, the list isn't that good, but having them as free preparations is always going to be nice. And unfortunately, that's the best thing that this subclass has going for it in 2024. Their first round of class features give them a fairly weak cantrip, Spare the Dying, and makes it difficult to be attacked directly by Undead. I say difficult because the big bads will blow through that saving throw, no problem, but the mooks will probably avoid you. And that's it. Moving on. 6th level. Once per long rest, you heal a small amount when you either make a death save or stabilize a creature. Once per long rest. Moving on. At 10th level, the Undying doesn't need sustenance and ages slower. Barely any mechanical value there. Moving on. 14th level is a once per short rest self-heal at 14th level for like no HP. Especially at 14th level, it's barely a first level cure spell. I feel like I'm going crazy here. Like that was it. That's the whole damn subclass. It is baffling how bad the Undying Warlock is. I mean, it's technically better than having no subclass at all, but that is a very low bar considering how much the Warlock subclass usually brings. Even compared to the 2014 Player's Handbook, this is the weakest Warlock subclass. And it's one I would just say don't use. Like, just use the Undead. There is no mechanical reason to use the Undying, nor is there a thematic one. The subclass has been completely replaced by the Undead, and that's fine because the Undying needs to die. So that is the Warlock. With the exception of the Undying, every option published is incredibly strong. Assuming the change in how spell lists work is brought over to these, then these are all extremely viable options, though I don't think any one dominates. Each one of them has a strong theme and good mechanics, just like all the entries in the 2024 Player's Handbook. It's an embarrassment of riches. But hey, next time I want to talk about a class known for permutations. Some might say it's in their blood. We're talking about sorcerers. But until then, just roll with it.